Thank you everyone for finding time to come and attend on such a sunny day my presentation on a subject that some not so exciting, but I do, and it is about when Russia uses force. And that's a question I have grappled with for a while. Journalists ask that question to me and my colleague Paul's very often, and I'll get to a point where I describe how there's an expectation that Russia will use force in certain circumstances, and there's a lot of speculation, and the wave subsides and everyone forgets until the next incident. So in my effort to look when, and we're talking about Vladimir Putin's Russia, so since 1999, when on December 31st he became the acting president of Russia. When does Putin's Russia intervene militarily? So if you look at the history of Putin's Russia, you'll see several cases when Russia did intervene militarily. And we saw that happen in Georgia in 2008, we saw that happen again in Ukraine in 2014, and it continues in current form, and in Syria, which became a subject of Russian intervention upon Assad's request in 2015, and that intervention continues today. But as important for figuring out when a country intervenes or not is to know the so-called counterfactuals. So when did Russia did not intervene? Well, first of all, and that again comes from questions that journalists ask often, is every time there's this proposition that every time there's a color revolution, Vladimir Putin feels like intervening. But Georgia had a revolution in 2003, the Rose Revolution. Then Ukraine had a revolution in 2004, Orange Revolution. Then Kyrgyzstan had one revolution in 2005, and then another one in 2010. And in between there was another effort in Ukraine, and then some say Russians were thinking whether to intervene in Montenegro as it decided to go into NATO, breaking away from the Yugoslavia, and then in Armenia in 2018. Again, many questions, many expectations that Russia would intervene, but it did not. And then apart from these revolutions, when Russia is expected to intervene, some of the major exercises that Russian military has annually had been preceded by expectations of Russian intervention. And I'll give you a couple of examples here. So one was during the annual exercise, and Russia holds these exercises on an annual basis, and each year strategic direction is chosen to host the exercise. So last year it was, for instance, Vostok exercise, in which Chinese participated. But the year before it was Zapad war games, and in the West, and that was preceded with expectations of Russia's intervention. And Russia did not intervene, nor did it intervene in 2016. Now, where do these expectations stem from? From the Russian practices, which was in 2008, the troops were pre-positioned in an exercise called Kavkaz, which were then, some of them, units of the 58th Army, which is based in the North Caucasus, participated in the Russian operation in South Ossetia and going further towards Gori, and then coming eventually to, I think, 60 kilometers away from Tbilisi. Russia also used war games as a pretext to reposition troops for its intervention in Crimea. And the same happened with Syria. This was all billed as exercises. So this is, if you will, a symptom, but not a cause of intervention. So if you look at the literature on interventions, you would see some recurrent subjects. There are propositions that I disagree with, such as that Russia intervenes to save peace. That's been made in literature. But there are also, cross-country studies, theoretical studies of intervention, and also country-specific studies that point that countries intervene when it's in their national interest to do so, and that national power plays a role. If you feel you're stronger than your opponent, you might be interested in intervening. And going back to Thucydides, we all know that the rise of Athens made Sparta so concerned that Athens would eventually overtake Sparta and its allies. So Sparta sort of made the first move. So that from that sort of discussion in the literature, I found these two propositions to be valid for the case of Vladimir Putin's Russia. And the two propositions, or the two conditions, if you will, are as follows. So the first condition is for Russia to intervene, Vladimir Putin and the Russian leadership, and I use this interchangeably because Putin is perhaps has the greatest monopoly on decision making since Stalin, in my view. So he's the ultimate decision maker who can overrule his entire Security Council and say we're going to intervene or not, we're not going to intervene. So if he feels there's an acute threat to Russia's vital national interests that no method short of a covert military intervention can tackle, he might be inclined to intervene. And we'll discuss it in a second how that played out in the three interventions I mentioned. But first we need to see what the national interests are. And here's the list I distilled from statements by Vladimir Putin, statements by other members of Russian military political leadership and Russian strategic documents. Going as far back as, by the way, the Afghan War, in which people like thoughtful, I think it's like Akhamiev and Mahmoud Gareev of the General Staff, Soviet General Staff, saw national interest as a key threat to national interest as a key precondition intervention against. So the ones in bold are the ones that I think are most recurrent in Putin thinking whether to intervene or not. And one is to ensure not only survival of allies, the case with Syria, but also that they stay alive with Russia. It's the case with, for instance, Ukraine or Georgia, at least being neutral. So that in that neighborhood, and Russia thinks of itself as a great power, so one of the classic definitions of great power is that it is able to project influence on its neighbors. So then, again, as another quality of great power is Russia's desire, national interest in preventing expansion of alliances or hegemons that it sees as hostile to Russia, which is, in Putin's view, it's NATO. So then, if we continue further down the list, you'd see another interest I marked in bold, and that's prevention of large-scale sustained terrorist attacks on Russia, not only because it's painful for the population and the leadership, but also because it enhances the threat of secession. And we saw a campaign in which methods, strategies of terrorism and guerrilla warfare were combined in the North Caucasus in efforts by local groups to have territories secede from Russia. So in this case we're thinking Syria, I'm thinking Syria, because more than 5,000 nationals of Russia went to Syria to join ISIS, Al-Qaeda and other groups, and in a way it's good for Russia because they're there, but if they ought to win, they would think would be the next target. And in Russian thinking, the next national target is Russia itself. So they would come back, train, arm, and fight another campaign, as they did in the 90s, and then in 2000s, trying to defend their separatist cause. So we discussed the first condition, and we are now getting to the second condition. You can read it here. So not only there has to be a threat to national interest or an opportunity to advance a national interest, but there also conditions have to be right for that to happen, and that it has to be, Russia has to have a reasonable hope that it's going to achieve at least stalemate in a conflict with a country against the intervening, so the threat to national interest does not grow any further. Ideally, it would reduce that threat, and that the cost of doing so would not be prohibitive. So that's the second condition, as I see it. So now let's discuss particular cases and see how these conditions played out when Russia did intervene. Well, in my view, conditions 1 and 2, so threat to national interest and harboring a reasonable hope that Russia would prevail or at least achieve a stalemate and that the cost would not be prohibitive, were both present prior to interventions in 3 countries. And these 3 countries are Georgia, Ukraine, as I said, and Syria. So the case of Georgia, what we see happening in Georgia. So it's August 2008. April 2008, NATO convenes a summit in which George W. Bush, then President of the United States, pushes. That becomes the culmination of his push to grant Georgia and Ukraine membership action plans, so that they would then join NATO. And Vladimir Putin is against it, and he personally travels to Bucharest to participate in discussions. And thanks to opposition from Merkel and Saradzhyan, so Chancellor of Germany and President of France, map is not granted. But if you read the communique of the summit, it says NATO and Georgia will be NATO members. Okay, doesn't say when, but it's there. So that's what Angela Stent is called the worst of both options. So you're not granting map, but you're also sort of provoking Russia by saying there will be a NATO. So 2 countries are there, and I'll discuss why intervene in Georgia and not Ukraine. So you cannot intervene in 2 because condition 2 would be absent. The cost would be prohibitive. Okay? But also Ukraine is giving Russia no pretext to intervene. Ukraine is not sending troops to retake part of Rostov-on-Don, for instance. Some Ukrainians say is also Ukraine. Cherkassk, so on and so on. So, but Saakashvili is. I mean, if you read the EU fact-finding mission's report on who started the war in Georgia, you would see that the ground offensive was launched by the Georgian side. Yes, there were artillery duels, there were exchanges of fire, but the first move on the ground was made by Georgian mechanized brigade that headed towards Tshinvali. So, with troops already prepositioned, knowing that this escalation can lead to Saakashvili believing he can intervene successfully and Russia would not intervene or would not have time to send troops through the rocky tunnel which separates Russia from South Ossetia and Georgia proper, he'd be able to intervene. So in that case, calculation is that the cost will not be prohibitive because Russian spin on this is that we are protecting A, our peacekeepers, and B, Russian citizens, because lots of South Ossetians and Abkhazians have been granted Russian passports in anticipation, among other things. You don't do everything for one only reason, but one of the reasons was that to strengthen Russian position vis-a-vis Georgia and say it's not just separatists, it's also Russian citizens. So the so-called принуждение к миру, coercing into peace, commenced. And the costs were not prohibitive. And that was a lesson that Putin then perhaps thought would be repeated in the case of Ukraine. The costs would not be prohibitive. And several months later, everyone would say, well, let's forget about that as well, and you get back to business as usual, which is what happened in the case of intervention in Georgia. Everyone condemned. Excuse me if I sound cynical, but I have to shorten the description of events. But then eventually, NATO-Russia Council meetings resumed, and everything went back to normal. So Putin thinking, is there a threat to national interest? Yes. Are there conditions? Is there a reasonable hope I can prevail? Yes. Would the cost be prohibitive? No, because I'm not invading 2 countries. I'm intervening in the country which has already made a move in shelling my peacekeepers and Russian citizens. So I am defending, I'm not guilty of aggression. So then comes Ukraine, the next case. And if we go back to national interest, again, Russia sees a threat. One is that a country that has been viewed as friendly to Russia under Yanukovych, a country that has been considering to set aside the European Union track and put on hold the association agreement with the EU, but also, get more involved with Russian-led integration projects, is now being overtaken by, opposition leaders who explicitly say they want to take their country west. Okay? So a threat of expansion of alliance, eventual alliance, that has said that Ukraine will be in NATO, and a threat to the interest of having friendly neighbors amongst which Russia can fight is there. So it's condition two presently. In Putin's view, yes. Well, first of all, troops are again pre-positioned. I mean, there were peacekeepers in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. There's entire Black Sea Fleet. Well, not the entire, but most of it is based on Sevastopol. Russia, I think, is allowed, according to the agreements that Yanukovych extended, to maintain, I think, 20,000 troops in Crimea, so at least 20,000 troops. So the troops are there. Okay, so if Russia were interested in intervening, it could. And in Putin's view, it would be like the case of Georgia. The cost would not be prohibitive because, as his public relations machine is trying to portray it, there's an acute threat to lives of Russian speakers in Crimea. And you can back and study the incident with the stoning of a bus and beating people. I would say, in my view, there was no major physical threat to the security of Russian speakers in Crimea. There was not. But in Putin's view, he thought he could portray this as something where, again, Russia comes to defend people rather than stage an aggression. So that's why the intervention commenced in covert front. Crimea was taken, and there's strong support for separatist cause in East Ukraine as another leverage to keep Ukraine out of NATO. Okay? So going back to interest, just like the case with Georgia, it's a signal to the West. If a country without Russia's explicit permission as a great power tries to escape West, we're going to intervene. So you didn't read my first signal in 2008. Here's another signal. What's going to happen? Not just to signal, not just to the countries that are buying NATO. And don't get me wrong. I understand that NATO, from the point of view of small nations, offers the best conditions of honoring your sovereignty. You get the right of veto. In the EU, you get the right of veto. So it's natural for these countries to want to be able to participate in alliances that the leaderships or parts of the elites think offers these best conditions for development and security. But Russia is a country you cannot ignore because of history and its national power. So you have to take into account what is going to be its reaction and what would be the cost for you if you were to become subject of that kind of reaction. So then we go to the case of Syria. And in Syria, if we go back to list of national interest, it's again survival of an ally, and Assad's regime has been under father or son one of the few allies that post-Soviet Russia has retained. Okay? Russia doesn't have too many allies, and Assad is one of them. So keeping him in power is something that is rooted in Russia's national interest, and not just because he's just an ally, but he also, I mean, how many of you buy Ladas, Russian cars? Well, Syrians do, I mean, and that's important because the economy is all about, not all about, but estimates vary, but around half, at least around half of Russian budget revenues come from oil and gas. So it's important to diversify the economy. Syria buys machinery from Russia, buys arms from Russia, buys cars from Russia. And it's an important foothold, because there's a naval base there. Well, it was a naval facility, now it's more of a base. So yes, that interest is there, and it's threatened because Assad is being pushed by power. But also, who is pushing Assad from power? Well, some say, hopefully moderates will prevail. I don't know. I mean, I don't have the crystal ball. But from my take, factions loyal to Al-Qaeda and ISIS, per se, were very strong, and they were prevailing in this disparate group of actors that were trying to unseat Assad. So, in Russian view, what would happen next? As I described, Assad and Al-Qaeda take over, and it's become a haven for groups that would then be looking to expand the caliphate. And the Salafi jihadist ideology is not about Syria, Iraq per se, Levant. It's about a caliphate, a global caliphate, where all Muslims will live are part of this universal structure that live in accordance with Sharia law. And that means North Caucasus, that means the Urals region, the Volga region, where there's substantial Muslim population, traditional, not just migrants. They've lived there for centuries. So definitely a threat that there will be escalation of attacks and they'll become sustained. And Russia lived through the 90s facing the specter of disintegration because it was going on in Chechnya. And definitely Vladimir Putin doesn't want that repeated. So he intervenes because of that, because of this threat. But are conditions also present? Does he have a reasonable hope that he can at least achieve stalemate? He thinks yes. He thinks that a combination of Iran-backed militias and Russian air power can at least put on hold further expansion of the rebel alliances in Syria. He also has already a naval base there repositioned, so he can, there is something he can send troops to. And finally, there's a perfectly legal justification from his point of view. If you think Assad is a legitimate ruler and says, come to my aid, I do. So both conditions were present in that case. And again, Vladimir Putin intervened. I wasn't very optimistic about the possible outcome of that intervention. I thought the most realistic situation would be a Syria divided and in constant fighting. But that's a stalemate that would have served Putin as well. So as long as the local non-state actors are focused on fighting Assad, they are not thinking about anything else. Like, what do we do in Russia? And in Russia, you'd see, with the rise of Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, you'd see how Islamic State local vilayats, provinces, so-called provinces, that they declared in North Caucasus, outdid factions associated with Al-Qaeda. The Emirate Caucasus, which has sunken into oblivion, and these guys were rising already at the time they were fighting Assad in Syria. So, if we look in cases, and I'll skip an instance or two. So, if you look in cases in Georgia, there's a color revolution. A US-educated lawyer comes to power, says he wants to take his country to the West. So why doesn't Russia intervene then? So I have a question mark here about whether both conditions were. But if you look at Putin's statements in 2001, 2002, he would be asking Clinton and then Lord Robertson, General Secretary of NATO, when Russia will be invited into NATO. So, and on several other occasions, he has publicly said, I cannot rule that Russia will become part of NATO. At that time, Russia is also pursuing alignment of its laws and regulations with the EU, so that it can become, these laws can be compatible with the EU. With the purpose of eventually, perhaps, becoming an associate member and then full-fledged member. So, as of 2003, in my view, Russia is very much focused still on integrating itself into the West. So someone who is also pursuing integration into the West is not an antagonist, right? I mean, true, Russia wanted to have itself accepted into NATO with certain privileges first and then others, but it's not like either or. So both countries were moving at that time in the same direction. So not a threat at the time. But condition 2 was not present either. It wasn't as it wasn't as strong as it was in 2014, for instance, because the national power of Russia, and I'll show you some of the charts, was still not, hasn't grown much. So perception in Putin's view of Russia was that the country that has just started recovering, not a country that has resurged and is rising, which is a view he developed towards 2010s, that Russia was already firmly on a trajectory of rise, and all its neighbors, of course, were dwarfed, but also it was rising vis-à-vis the West. So in Putin's view, at that time, he was still thinking West is a very important leading economic powerhouse, and Russia is still recovering. So condition 2 was not as much present, because if I were to challenge countries that were trying to seek alliances with West, maybe the cost would be prohibitive. So, but then if you look at Kyrgyzstan in 2005, you would see that there's again color revolution, and a very pro-Russian leader, Askar Akayev, is being sidelined. So why doesn't Russia intervene? Well, because condition 1 is absent. Why? Because the person who succeeds Akayev, Kurmanbek Bakiyev, is as pro-Russian as Akayev. So if there's some kind of popular change that makes the Kyrgyz more satisfied with the way they're governed, and the country is still pro-Russian, the color revolution itself is not a sole condition that would force Russia to intervene. So Russia did not intervene. In 2010, exactly the same thing happens. But this time, Kurmanbek Bakiyev, who is being pushed out, explicitly says, please intervene, like Assad does. And we are members of CSTO, Collective Security Treaty Organization. There's a clause there that you got to help me, and Russia does not help. Again, why? Because Rosa Atambayeva, who succeeds, who pushes Kurmanbek Bakiyev out of power, is as pro-Russian as her predecessor. She doesn't come to power saying, I'm going to pursue integration into NATO, which by then already Putin has developed a dim view of. Okay, so in that period between 2003 and 2010, his views have changed, and we can discuss why. So finally, Armenia. Again, I feel that many calls from journalists saying there's a revolution. What do you think of the threat that Russia will intervene? I mean, there's a base there, so condition 2 is there. Right? So why not intervene? Well, because condition 1 is absent. Because the first thing that Nikol Pashinyan does when he becomes the leader of this interim government, he says that we're going to keep Armenia cooperating with the CSTO, Collective Treaty Organization, and the Eurasian Union. He's not saying anything like we're going to be in NATO and EU. So Russia is not happy. Vladimir Putin is not happy because, again, unlawful change in his view of God, a neighboring country, but not a sufficient condition to intervene. And then when we look at 2 more counterfactuals, we see that condition 2 is, in my view, absent. So if you look in Ukraine in 2008, when Putin already has a dim view of NATO, as I described earlier, he had the choice. So 2 countries. If you want to send a signal that this is a red line to the West and post-Soviet republics, that if a country wants to pursue a NATO membership and seeks a membership action plan, I'm going to intervene. So the purpose is not to grab more land. The purpose is to send a signal that this is my red line. Okay? You're violating my national interest, that in his view. Okay? So sufficient to intervene in one country, and which of the two countries is easier to intervene in? Obviously the country that is smaller. Obviously both countries have Russian troops on their territory, but obviously the country that has made the first move, which was to send infantry, mechanized infantry on the ground offensive towards Zimbabwe. And in 2016, I mean, these are all allegations, so I'm not privy to what actually Russia did or didn't do, but the allegations are that Russia tried to stage a coup. Okay, so why stage a coup if it did try to stage a coup rather than intervene? Well, because there are no troops, so you have to ferry them. So rite of passage, A, and B, what would be the cost of you, without any pretext whatsoever, having suddenly little green man in Montenegro? The cost would be prohibitive, especially now that you've learned what is happening to you in terms of sanctions, with your ongoing intervention in Ukraine. So we discussed how these two conditions play out. Let me quickly walk you through additional argument in terms of prohibitive costs and having a reasonable hope of prevailing as exemplified in condition 2 by showing you some charts I've shown before about national power, okay, and how that rise in that influence Putin's perception that Russia can withstand whatever costs that will be imposed on it. So various methods of measuring national power. One simple one, but perhaps not the most accurate one, is just looking at how the share of the country's GDP changes in the world share. The others are a bit more complex. They involve things like share of countries' defense expenditures in world's defense expenditure, share of countries' land and population, and so on and so forth. So all this, no matter what charts you look at, so this is a chart that looks at cases of China, Germany, France, Britain, Russia, and US. So this is Russia, right? This is China. These are the Western countries. So this is the share of countries' GDP and world's GDP. You see Russia is overtaking West in terms of rate of change, okay? Not absolute power, because by absolute power, US is still the dominant force by far, okay? But if you are thinking West is declining, I'm rising, so, I have to have more say in what's going on in my neighborhood, and perhaps the cost of doing so would not be as prohibitive. Okay, so this is Russia. You see where, China is, and US is, and India, so Russia is far behind, but the rate of change is in Russia's favor, okay, not in favor of West. So the other methods, again, show that Russia's performance is better than the West. So yes, Russia declined a bit compared to the rest of the world as a whole, in that period. But compared to Western countries, it's rising. So you see in all methods that Russia is doing better than the West. And it definitely has more power than any of its post-Soviet neighbors. So all this stuff can help influencing the way Russians think about whether, if I intervene, we intervene, whether conditions would be prohibitive or not. So, and if you think what two conditions have driven this rise, there are, in my view, twofold. Well, one is exemplified in all of these methods of measuring, but one is not. So the one that is exemplified is the change in economic power. So the combination of rising oil prices and liberal reforms in Russia pushed the GDP up. But also, as the last method I use, and that's based on method developed by a US intelligence analyst that takes into account the quality of governance, if you will. The quality of governance has improved in Russia as well, okay? And it has improved dramatically according to World Bank. So these two factors influence the way Russian national power changed, but also the way Russian leadership perceived their country vis-à-vis West. So suddenly they see Russia as resurgent, West is declining, and also in all these graphs you'd see, in all of them, China is rising, okay? China is rising. This is China. So we discussed conditions that have to be in place, in Vladimir Putin's view, to intervene. What about the outcomes, okay? So these conditions, when present, make Vladimir Putin decide that it's time to intervene. What about the outcomes? Well, if you look at the national interests of Russia, and I marked the positive impact in green, and the negative impact in red, you'd see there's mixed results. So Vladimir Putin thinks the overriding national interest for him in all these cases is preventing allies from escaping, and more importantly, preventing further expansion of NATO. So he's achieving that, in his view, both in Ukraine and in Georgia. Okay? But if you look at other interests that he thinks perhaps are not as important, vital but not as important, you'd see negative impact. Obviously, relations with the West deteriorated in the wake of the intervention in Ukraine, and there's a lasting damage, unlike the case of intervention in Georgia in 2008. So what else does he take into account, which is not a vital national interest, but which is Russia's ruling elite always has in mind? And some make it the overarching objective. I don't agree so. I think national interests come first in Russia. Of course, it's the ruling elite's survival. Okay. So if we were to look at this additional benefit, the additional benefit is that you, first of all, in Georgia, you sort of humiliate and sap the power of a pro-Western leader. Okay. In the case of Ukraine, the same thing. You show that you are willing to use force if a pro-Russian leader is pushed out. Okay. But you are not successful, so the results are mixed. And finally, in the case of Assad, you are sending a signal to all of your allies, but also to opponents within Russia, that Vladimir Putin's Russia is prepared to use force to keep Assad in power, but also it's a signal that, if you are thinking I'm like Gorbachev, and I would hesitate to use power, if challenged, I will use power. Okay. So then, if we go further, of course, what are the costs? And the most horrendous costs are casualties. Okay. So you look at Ukraine, more than 13,000 dead. In Syria, estimates of how many people died because of Russian bombing varies. Okay. But unfortunately, that's the reality. Vladimir Putin, as some of the other leaders in the world, think that these are acceptable costs. That killing people, people die in thousands and even 10,000s, but it benefits your country. And if you read an excellent book by Fiona Hill and Clifford Getty about Putin's identities, so one of the identities is that he's a statist, державник. So that's держава, the great power, is important for him. So it is worth defending your держава, your great power, is more important than human lives, in his view. Okay. So if you look at the costs of intervention, economic costs, well, you'd see that the common Russians suffered, although it's very difficult to separate the impact of sanctions from the impact of the general economic downturn that was occurring anyway, as oil prices went down and the whole economic model based on growth of oil prices was becoming obsolete. Russian economy was bound to suffer some consequences even in the absence of sanctions. So it's difficult to say which of the two factors played greatest role. In my view, the general economic downturn played the greatest view, but sanctions contributed. But you see real incomes going down. At the same time, however, and this we come back to this famous notion that Russians are willing to endure sufferings as long as their power, as Russia remains great. At the same time, polls by private pollsters, so this is not the state polling, but Levada Center, the most respected private pollster in Russia, shows that majority of Russians were completely unworried and thought they were unaffected by sanctions. Okay? So even though they suffered, they felt they were not affected somehow. But also, 55% polled by Pew, which is an American pollster, said in August 2000 they would support country's intervention in a neighboring country. So are the costs prohibitive so far, in Vladimir Putin's view? They are tangible, but they are not prohibitive. Okay? So he remains convinced that common Russians are still supportive of interventions. I'm not talking about his popularity at the moment, but of interventions, even though they suffered. What about the Russian ruling elite? You would see that they actually did well. I mean, they would have done even better without sanctions, but you cannot go to Putin if you're an oligarch and complain, I haven't become richer enough, okay? I only became rich as much, and if no sanctions, I would be even richer, okay? You could say there's economic pain if your fortune were declining, but they are not, if you look at the Forbes list, okay? In 2003 and 2018, a drop of nearly 1%. So, but what about oligarchs that became oligarchs under Vladimir Putin, that is the prime source of his reliance in Russian ruling elite? So his supporters within the government structures, of course, important, but the economic elite, this is his sort of economic guard. People like Timchenko and Rothenberg brothers, you would see that their fortunes actually increased. Why did they increase? Because, among other things, they were exempted from certain taxes because they fell under sanctions, and because Putin got an even more explicit reason to dole out government contracts to them. Okay? And if you look at the lower level, like not billionaires, but millionaires, you will see that their numbers also grew. So the rich, the people who are suffering are common Russians. Putin feels he's fine. He feels that national interests are being advanced, although I would disagree because you know, there's some tangible damage, and that his supporters in the business elite are also doing well. Okay. So then, going back to common Russians, these are two indices of measuring Putin's approval and confidence. Okay. And again, it's very difficult to separate which part of the decline can be associated with the costs that Russians incurred because of interventions, such as sanctions and loss of part of the Ukrainian market, and which are the result of his unpopular measures. I would say the unpopular measures mattered more, like increasing pension age. That really hurt, okay? But then, if you look at his economic policies, he's hoarding up the money. He's not sharing. Russian budget has a substantial proficiency these days, but he's not sharing the money with population. He's hoarding it up for his 12 national projects. So rather than finance more payments to public sector workers, pensioners, he's hoarding money. So I think that combination explains decline in his approval rating, which is still 64%. I mean, he's an authoritarian ruler, so that of course influences the way people view him inside Russia. So he's not a democratically elected in a Western democracy. But again, if you compare to Erdogan, who is a fellow strongman, he has a better approval rating than Erdogan. Has a better approval rating than Merkel probably, and Macron definitely. But again, these are not his peers. I mean, these are Western democracies. Russia is a soft authoritarian regime. And what should worry him is the loss of confidence. This is unprecedented for him to have such a low rate of confidence, but his bet is that once this money that he has hoarded up and invested into national projects are going to have impact, there'll be a trickle-down impact, and the population will become happy again. Okay, so these are the sort of bits and pieces on actual impact of sanctions that were estimated by respected people like Kudrin and experts that Bloomberg pulled on the subject. You'd see that these are not prohibitive costs. They are tangible, but they are not prohibitive. Okay. And then if you look at relations with separate countries, you would see the same kind of tendency, where the countries with which relations have declined because of sanctions and counter-sanctions in the West, they are losing the share in Russia's trade. Whereas China, which has benefited from that because Russia has had to turn to Asia even more, has seen an increase. The same kind of thing, trajectory if you look at blocks of countries, groups of countries. EU, remarkable decline in 2013, just before the intervention in Ukraine, and 2018, the latest data, one-third, trade decline, one-third. Of course, it also has to do with the decline of Europe economically in the overall global economy and continuing rise of China. Okay, so you trade more with a country that is expanding and buying more and selling more. So I'm going to skip the conclusion. I'm just going to leave it here, and it's already past 45 minutes. So the conclusions are that these two conditions, threat to national interest and for Putin to think there's a reasonable hope Russia will prevail at a cost that will not be prohibitive, are the ones that drive the Russian leadership decisions whether to intervene. So when next time there's a color revolution or any kind of a crisis, keep those two conditions in mind. Maybe they could help you to calculate whether Vladimir Putin is going to be sending troops overtly or covertly or not. Thank you.